How often does fate decide to be merciless, confronting a person with the heavy burden of their nature? Charles II, the last representative of the Habsburg dynasty, was a living example of how hereditary defects can determine the course of history. He could not speak clearly. His tongue seemed too large for his mouth, and he often choked while eating. His gaze was empty and lost, like that of a child trapped in the body of an old man. Sometimes, he would stare into the void for hours, as if seeing what was hidden from the eyes of others. His hands trembled when he tried to lift a cup. Each clumsy movement reflected the weight of centuries-old genetic errors. His voice was barely audible, wet, nasal, interrupted by bouts of coughing. Every movement seemed an unconscious choreography of pain. At court, no one knew how to address him, whether to fear or pity, to look him in the eye or to turn away. When Charles II died, his autopsy shocked the world. His heart was the size of a walnut, his intestines rotten and black, and his single testicle completely burned. His skull was filled with foul-smelling cerebrospinal fluid, effectively replacing brain matter. It seemed that the king's body had begun to decay from the moment of his birth. However, his story is not only that of a sick monarch, but also a chronicle of a court where dwarfs, jesters, freaks, madmen, people with demonic possessions, and even a monster girl brought before the throne for the amusement of the nobility gathered. This is not a fairy tale, but a Baroque horror story, full of darkness and despair. To understand how it all came to such a state, one must look at the root cause, the vicious circle of inbreeding. This phenomenon, based on ideas of blood purity and the family purity of the dynasty, became both a trap and a crown. The royal family sought to multiply its influence, forgetting the inevitable consequences of genetic diseases. Charles's fate was predetermined even before his birth. In that era, the monarch's weakness and ailments were explained by curses and even magic. He was called the Bewitched, which fit perfectly into the atmosphere of superstition and religious fears of the time. His spiritual exile was condemned as punishment for the empire's sins, and the king's mother spread rumors of witchcraft to papal curias and courts, fueling mystical conjectures throughout Europe. Today we know that behind it all was not a magical curse, but a deep biological imprint, genetic mutations arising from centuries of close-kin marriages. Charles was born on the 6th of November, 1661, in Madrid, into a family already feeling the fatigue of its blood. His father, King Philip IV, and mother, Mariana of Austria, were connected by hundreds of kinship ties, which gave rise to a whole bouquet of hereditary diseases. From childhood, Charles was frail and weak. At 3 years old, he lost his father, and at 4, he was declared king. The regency was effectively taken over by his mother, but many at court understood. The problem was not only his age. Charles could not rule fully. His development was severely delayed. He began to walk only at 6 and was able to speak clearly only after 8. The doctors of that time were powerless against the young king's mysterious illnesses. No one could explain the cause of his condition, and political intrigues only worsened the situation. It was in these conditions that it became clear that not only the health, but the fate of a vast empire literally rested on the fragile shoulders of this unfortunate man. If you enjoy such calm stories about history, please subscribe to the channel. It's free and helps me continue. The sad story of Charles II stands apart among European monarchs. Doctors of his time could not understand the causes of his numerous ailments and sometimes attributed them to mystical forces or divine punishment. Today we know that the true cause of his illnesses was the centuries-old practice of incest in the House of Habsburg, where blood marriages between cousins, uncles, and nieces were common. This led to an extremely high coefficient of consanguinity, which caused deep genetic degradation of the lineage. manifested in the monarch's severe physical and mental deficiencies, becoming the main factor in his inability to effectively govern the country. Instead of actual power, Charles II's reign was accompanied by manipulations from his mother and spiritual advisors, and court life resembled more a grotesque theater than the center of imperial might. Contemporaries perceive this as a curse or demonic possession, but today scientists offer a much more prosaic, though grim, explanation: the consequences of extreme forms of incest and hereditary diseases. Charles was physically weak and deformed, barely able to move without support. His body did not correspond to the image of a warrior king and active ruler. He remained childless despite 2 marriages, the second of which was to Mariana of Neuburg, a deeply superstitious German princess convinced that the king was possessed by dark forces, which prevented them from having heirs. She claimed to have seen the devil in his chambers, and the couple became a symbol of tragicomedy. He, a ghost on the throne; she, a fanatical keeper of relics and superstitions. At the same time, Spain was losing its influence on the world stage. Charles did not make decisions and barely understood state affairs, which were effectively managed by favorites such as the Count of Oropesa and his mother, Mariana of Austria, who never fully relinquished power. Meanwhile, on the international stage, France and Austria greedily contested the inheritance of the Spanish Empire, foreshadowing political upheavals. Even in rare moments of clarity, Charles signed documents without understanding their content, struggled to read texts, often got lost in conversations, sometimes wondering if his long-deceased father was still alive. The State Council revolved around his figure with a mixture of pity, fear, and greed. Court life turned into a strange performance. The king, a living symbol of hereditary disease, was surrounded by processions of saints, nightly prayers, healers, exorcists, and various entertainments for one who rarely smiled. At a time when the empire, once holding half the world in its hands, was rapidly falling apart, its throne creaked under the weight of decline and disease. Moreover, during Charles's reign, the practice inherited from Philip IV and previous Habsburgs intensified, whereby people with physical and mental disabilities were kept at court for amusement. The court was full of dwarfs who not only acted as jesters, but were regarded almost as pets of the nobility. They were dressed in church vestments or knightly armor to provoke laughter, and were sometimes forced to fight, dance in entertainment scenes, or perform as living caricatures of the aristocracy. Their names and features were recorded in court registers as pieces of furniture. Their names and peculiarities were recorded in court registers as if they were pieces of furniture. At the court of Charles II, this tradition took on a frightening development. People with severe deformities, gigantism, microcephaly, and clearly expressed mental disorders were brought in, turning them into spectacular anatomical curiosities around the king himself, who suffered from bodily and mental ailments. In one of the darkest and strangest periods in Spanish history, when the king himself was a tragic, deformed, and suffering figure, the line between jester and monarch was almost completely erased. Charles II was not elevated on a pedestal of power, but seemed to stand on the edge of the very monstrosity that surrounded him. Chronicles of the time tell of sinister dinners, where several dwarves sat under the table to entertain the king, with absurd nudges and grotesque sounds. Others were trained to parody the attending nobles, distorting their expressions in humiliating miniatures. Often, buffoonish processions were arranged, where ugly figures dressed as bishops or viceroys mocked the broken and decaying institutional system of the empire. Among this carnival of characters forgotten by history, one figure stood out especially: Josefa Monastero, called the Child Monster. She was an adult woman whose body seemed frozen in a child's form, and her story deserved a separate tale. However, in the midst of this phantasmagoric ball, a figure appeared that shocked the entire royal retinue more than any other. It was a girl with the body of an adult woman. Josefa Monastero, barely 6 years old, had a body over 1.5 meters tall, with incredibly elongated limbs and a chest developed like that of an adult woman, while her childlike gaze caused bewilderment and anxiety in all who saw her. Her face retained the innocence of a child trapped in a disproportionate shell, a mistake of nature and a true scandal for the time, but at the same time an object of almost painful curiosity at the court of Charles II. She was discovered in a remote village by curious doctors, and soon the girl, wrapped in luxurious silk, was brought to the royal palace. Servants hiding horror behind masks of obedience, and courtiers not knowing where to look, received this strange creature in their halls, and the king demanded to see her alone. In the silence of a special room, where the entire atmosphere seemed soaked with anxiety, he sat on the throne, and she stood, covered only by a light cloak that could not conceal her striking figure. Charles looked at the girl motionlessly, and witnesses of those moments claimed that a strange smile appeared on his face, or that he whispered something understandable only to himself. Chroniclers painted this meeting with trembling ink, noting how the girl with the adult body was forced to appear before the king almost as a curiosity. For several days, investigators of medical science approached her, measuring, drawing, discussing. Doctors doubted whether her appearance was the result of early gigantism, a hormonal disorder, or a manifestation of some divine sign. None of the hypotheses found solid confirmation. The young body did not withstand the test of time, and soon the girl died, after which she was autopsied, regarded as an anatomical anomaly. Her name was preserved in the chronicles as one of the darkest aspects of the kingdom of freaks at the court. This story, like the fate of Charles himself, became not merely a tale of physical deformity, but a testament to a culture that turned misfortune into a peculiar spectacle. Josefa became the last bitter vision of horror, the final crooked smile in a realm of pain and suffering. The belief in a dark curse that supposedly doomed the king to infertility, illness, and mental afflictions became so strong that the court arranged a series of official exorcisms in the royal palace. Charles was perceived not simply as a sick man, but as if possessed. They did not seek medicine, but aimed for spiritual purification. Monks exorcists were invited, including both Spanish and German demonology experts, among whom the most famous was the monk Fri Froilandius, who claimed that the king had been subjected to evil spells and witchcraft. During the rituals, priests stood around Charles with crosses, holy water, and relics, loudly reciting prayers, while the king endured convulsions, uttered incoherent cries, or simply collapsed, powerless. This was the last desperate attempt to free the king from invisible chains that seemed far more terrifying than physical ailments. Thus ended one of the most sinister periods in Spanish history, when power, fear, and mysticism intertwined in a chorus of strange figures and tragic fates. It was terrifying to see the king moan and scream during agonizing fits, followed by incoherent cries or complete exhaustion and collapse of the body. In one of the recorded testimonies preserved in the Inquisition archives, there was a description of an incident when the king expelled a black, thick substance with a sharp smell of sulfur. This was interpreted as the expulsion of a demon from the body. This story was studied carefully, even in the Vatican, so much did it shock contemporaries. His wife, Mariana of Neuburg, was deeply convinced that a dark curse had been laid upon her husband forever, and she kept religious relics in her bedroom, amulets of saints, and even, according to rumors, a hair of St. John the Baptist. In that palace ruled by fear and mysticism, religious fanaticism, superstition, and genuine terror of the inexplicable were intertwined. The doctors of that time were powerless to explain Charles's condition. while the passion for religious salvation of the burnt-out spirit and empire intensified the surrounding despair. Charles II died in the Madrid Alcazar on the 1st of November, 1700, after an exhausting and agonizing ordeal lasting several weeks. He was only 38 years old, but his body seemed alien and filled with suffering, as if burdened by the weight of several lives. Witnesses of the king's last days recounted that he did not recognize his close ones, suffered hallucinations, and spoke with imaginary characters. His breathing was noisy and intermittent, and his limbs so stiff that the slightest movement caused hellish pain. After death, an autopsy was performed, which forever remained one of the most terrifying and detailed medical reports of that era. The king's heart was tiny, like a forest nut. His lungs were rotten and diseased, his stomach ulcerated and covered with wounds. His intestines showed signs of gangrene, and one of his testicles was as black as coal. In his skull, rancid fluid was found, and his brain was almost destroyed, leading doctors to compare its condition to the decomposition of a body, despite the fact that he had still been breathing. The entire body of the king seemed to have been corroded from within by decades of genetic isolation, caused by dynastic inbreeding. Yet he was forced to fulfill royal duties, to marry, to rule the country, to maintain the illusion of the empire's power, which in reality had long been doomed. The death of Charles II was not merely the passing of a man, but the end of the Habsburg era in Spain. It was followed by the War of the Spanish Succession, an international conflict sparked by the dispute over the vacant throne and symbolic authority that had lost its former significance. With the king's departure, the flame of the Spanish Habsburg dynasty was extinguished. The story of Charles II is not only a chronicle of the illness and suffering of one monarch, but also a testament to how a cruel system self-destructed, failing to grasp the limits of its ambitions, confusing spiritual purity with a heavy curse, creating a court where vices were accepted as the norm. This unfortunate king became a reflection of an entire era, wounded, sick, and crushed by its own delusions, and his legacy stands as a warning to any civilization that recklessly plays with blood and genetics without understanding the grave consequences. However, this is only the beginning, and the narrative will further unfold the most horrifying episode of Charles's royal court, the true story of Josefa Monasterio, known as the Monster Maiden. The forthcoming account promises staggering revelations that will change the perspective on that era. And if you already think you've seen everything, even more surprises and dark secrets await you ahead.